Libra, welcome back, my beautiful souls. I hope you're doing well and taking a moment for yourself today. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that this is a general reading, so take what resonates and simply leave the rest. And Libra, I have to say, the energy around you feels really interesting. It's almost like something has been happening behind the scenes. Conversations, realizations, little pieces of information coming together when you weren't even looking. Somebody may be seeing you very differently than they did before. And what's fascinating is that this shift didn't happen overnight. It feels like something was said, something was heard, or maybe a conversation took place that quietly changed the way they look at you now. So let's slow down, take a breath, and see what the cards want to reveal about this energy surrounding you. Okay, the first thing I'm noticing is that someone keeps replaying the past in their mind. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that feels chaotic. It's quieter than that. It's almost like they're sitting alone with their thoughts and finally allowing themselves to be honest. Because the moment I pull the judgment card, I get this feeling of reflection. Not the kind where someone is blaming themselves every second of the day. More like they're reviewing old memories and realizing that some of the conclusions they came to weren't entirely fair. And Libra, what's interesting is that your energy doesn't feel loud in this reading. You're not chasing anyone. You're not trying to prove anything. You're simply existing. Yet somehow your absence, your silence, or maybe just your distance has created space for somebody to think. You know, sometimes people only hear themselves clearly when everything else gets quiet. And that's exactly what this feels like. I keep seeing someone revisiting conversations, reading between the lines, remembering things you said months ago, maybe even years ago for some of you. Little moments that didn't seem important at the time suddenly feel significant. It's almost like they're looking at old photographs and noticing details they completely missed the first time. And then I see the Justice card. Now the atmosphere changes, because this person isn't only remembering the past, they're weighing it, they're measuring it, they're looking at situations that once felt simple, and realizing they were far more complicated than they originally believed. I have to be honest, it feels like someone is recognizing that they may have judged you too quickly. Maybe they assumed they knew your intentions. Maybe they believed something they heard. Maybe they allowed their own fears to create a story that wasn't entirely true. Whatever happened, there is a strong feeling of reconsideration here. And Libra, I keep hearing the phrase, that wasn't the whole picture. Because this person is beginning to understand there were things happening beneath the surface that they didn't fully see. And now those missing pieces are starting to appear. The Six of Cups is sitting here, and immediately I feel warmth, not perfect memories, not fantasy, just warmth. The kind that sneaks up on somebody when they're least expecting it. A familiar laugh, a familiar voice, a familiar feeling. You know how certain songs can transport you back to a specific chapter of your life? That's what this energy reminds me of. There are moments connected to you that keep resurfacing in this person's mind. And every time they return, the memory feels slightly different, softer, clearer, more honest. It's like they're finally allowing themselves to appreciate what was there instead of focusing only on what was missing. And that's important because I don't actually feel regret as the dominant emotion here. I feel realization. Regret is present, yes, but realization feels bigger because when somebody truly regrets something, they often focus on themselves. But when somebody begins to understand another person's value, their attention shifts outward. They start seeing the effort, the patience, the understanding, the things they may have overlooked before. And Libra, that's where this reading becomes emotional because the Five of Cups appears. And immediately I notice someone looking at what could have been handled differently. Not with panic, not with desperation, just honesty, raw honesty. I keep getting this image of somebody sitting in their car after a long day. The radio is playing quietly. They're staring through the windshield. And for whatever reason, your name crosses their mind. Then another memory follows. Then another. And before they know it, they're questioning choices they once felt completely certain about. It's interesting because this doesn't feel like someone trying to rewrite history. It feels like someone finally acknowledging it. Acknowledging your role, acknowledging your effort, acknowledging your heart. And maybe most importantly, acknowledging that you carried more of the emotional weight than they realized. There's also something here about conversations, private conversations, the kind that happen when people let their guard down. I don't necessarily feel like everyone around them knows what's going on. In fact, this feels surprisingly personal. But I do feel moments where your name comes up, moments where somebody asks a question, moments where an opinion is shared. Every one of those conversations seems to push this person a little closer toward understanding something they weren't ready to face before. because the energy keeps bringing me back to the same thought. They are seeing you differently now, not because you've changed into somebody else, but because they're finally looking from a different angle. And the more they reflect, the harder it becomes to ignore what they've discovered. Because there are still a few things hidden beneath the surface here. A few thoughts that haven't been spoken out loud yet. A few realizations that seem to be growing stronger every time your name enters the room. Because I keep seeing this Page of Swords energy lingering around the edges of the reading, almost like somebody who keeps telling themselves they're just curious, when it's actually much deeper than that. You know, there are people who ask about someone once and then move on with their day. This doesn't feel like that. This feels like somebody who brings your name up in conversation without even realizing how often they're doing it. A song comes on. Something reminds them of you. A friend mentions a situation that's vaguely similar, and suddenly you're part of the discussion again. It's subtle, but it keeps happening. What's interesting is that I don't think this person originally intended to talk about you as much as they have. I think it started with questions. Simple questions. The kind people ask when they're trying to understand something they can't quite figure out on their own. And every answer seemed to create another question. Every conversation opened another door. Every opinion they received somehow led them back to the same place, back to you. The Three of Cups is sitting here now, and immediately I feel voices around them. Friends, family, trusted people, not a crowd, not gossip. Just a handful of conversations happening behind closed doors. The kind where people lean back in their chairs and finally say what they've really been thinking. And Libra, I have to be honest, I don't think this person expected the feedback they received. Because I'm seeing moments where they bring you up, perhaps hoping somebody will confirm their doubts. Maybe hoping somebody will validate the reasons they pulled away. Maybe hoping somebody will help them make sense of their confusion. But that's not exactly what happens. Instead, I keep hearing responses that make them pause. Responses that challenge the story they've been telling themselves. Almost like somebody saying, have you ever considered it from their perspective? Or, maybe they cared more than you realized. Or even, maybe you're still talking about them because they're important to you. And that last one hits differently. Because the energy shifts every time someone points out the obvious, not obvious to us. Obvious to everyone around them. Everyone except the person feeling it. It's funny how that works sometimes. The people closest to us can often see what's happening long before we're willing to admit it ourselves. And that's exactly what I'm picking up. There are moments where this person is talking about you, but they're actually talking around their feelings instead of directly through them. They're describing situations. They're describing memories. They're describing things you said, things you did, the way you handled certain moments, the way you carried yourself. But underneath all of it, they're really trying to understand why you remain in their thoughts. And every conversation seems to bring them one step closer to the answer. The star appears here, and suddenly everything feels quieter, softer, more reflective. I keep seeing somebody lying awake after one of these conversations. The room is dark, the television is off, the phone has already been set down, but their mind keeps replaying something they heard earlier, something somebody said about you, something that felt true, a little too true, and now they're sitting with it, not running from it, not distracting themselves, just sitting with it. Because the more they talk about you, the more difficult it becomes to pretend that you're simply another person from the past. You still occupy space inside their world, not necessarily because they're trying to hold on, but because something about you left an impression that never fully disappeared. And I keep getting the feeling that this realization catches them off guard, because they may have convinced themselves they were over it, over the questions, over the curiosity, over whatever connection existed here. Yet every time your name enters a conversation, something inside them responds, like a tuning fork recognizing a familiar frequency. And that's where the Queen of Cups enters the reading. The atmosphere becomes emotional, not dramatic, just honest, deeply honest. Because this person is beginning to understand that what they feel isn't rooted in logic alone. It never was. For some of you, they're recognizing that they respected you more than they admitted. For others, they're realizing they felt emotionally safe around you in ways they haven't experienced elsewhere. And for some, they're beginning to acknowledge that your presence affected them long after interactions ended. I keep hearing somebody say, why does this still matter to me? And the answer doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives piece by piece, conversation by conversation, memory by memory, observation by observation. That's why these discussions feel so important. They're not creating feelings. They're revealing feelings that were already there, feelings that had been sitting quietly beneath the surface, waiting, not demanding attention, just waiting to be noticed. And Libra, the fascinating part is that every time this person tries to analyze you, they end up discovering something about themselves instead. Every question about you somehow turns into a question about their own heart. Every attempt to understand your significance leads them deeper into their own emotions. Which is why I keep sensing another conversation approaching. Not necessarily with you just yet, but another moment where your name enters the room, another moment where somebody asks a simple question, and another moment where this person finds themselves revealing more than they intended. And another moment where this person finds themselves revealing more than they intended. Because underneath all of that reflection, there's something else surfacing here, something they haven't been completely comfortable looking at. The Temperance card appears, and immediately I get this image of somebody trying to reconcile different parts of themselves. Not different versions of you, different versions of them. You know, sometimes people think the biggest obstacle in a connection is distance, timing, or circumstances. But I have to be honest, this feels much more personal than that. This feels like someone who spent a long time wrestling with their own contradictions. Part of them wanted closeness. Part of them wanted control. Part of them wanted certainty. Part of them was terrified of what would happen if they allowed themselves to care too much. And those parts didn't always work together. So there were moments where they moved closer, then pulled away. Moments where they felt something deeply, then questioned it. Moments where they wanted to speak, then convinced themselves to stay silent. What's interesting is that the silence wasn't always about you. The silence often came from battles they were having within themselves, the kind nobody else could see, the kind that followed them home after conversations ended, the kind that stayed with them long after everyone else had gone to sleep. And now the hermit is sitting here. The room suddenly feels quieter. The energy slows down. I keep seeing someone spending more time alone than usual, not because they want to isolate forever, not because they're angry, not because they're avoiding life. It's almost like they needed space to hear their own thoughts without outside interference. Because for a very long time, I feel like there were too many voices around them. Friends with opinions, family with expectations, people who thought they knew what was best, people who believed they were helping, people who offered advice that sounded reasonable on the surface. But the deeper this person looked, the more they realized some of those voices weren't actually helping them understand their own heart. They were helping them avoid it. And that's a difficult realization, because once somebody notices that, they begin questioning everything, not in a rebellious way, in an honest way. They start asking themselves, what do I actually want? What am I truly afraid of? Am I protecting myself or am I hiding? And Libra, those questions don't always have comfortable answers, because the Eight of Swords appears here and immediately I feel hesitation. Not current hesitation, old hesitation, the kind that's been carried for years, the kind that becomes so familiar a person stops noticing it's there. I keep hearing someone say, what if they don't feel the same? Then another voice answers, what if they do? Then another fear appears. What if I get hurt? What if I'm misunderstood? What if I make the wrong choice? It's almost like every possible path came with a warning label attached to it. And when somebody spends enough time living inside those fears, they begin mistaking them for facts. That's why this energy feels so significant, because they're beginning to notice the difference. They're beginning to realize that not every fear deserves authority. Not every doubt deserves a vote. Not every worst-case scenario deserves to dictate the future. And that's where the Death card enters. Okay, I know the atmosphere changes whenever this card arrives, but what I'm feeling isn't dramatic. It's surprisingly peaceful. It's like standing in a room after everything unnecessary has finally been cleared away. Old assumptions, old narratives, old defenses, old excuses. Things they once relied upon no longer fit the person they're becoming. And that process hasn't been effortless. Far from it. I actually feel moments where this person resisted it. Moments where they wanted to stay comfortable. Moments where they wanted to keep repeating familiar patterns because familiar patterns feel safe. Even when they're painful. Even when they lead nowhere, at least they're predictable. But something inside them has been changing. Slowly, quietly, steadily. The fascinating thing is that I don't think this transformation began because someone forced them to change. I think life started showing them certain truths they couldn't ignore anymore. Certain cycles kept repeating. Certain lessons kept returning. Certain emotions kept resurfacing. Until eventually they had to stop and ask themselves why. And every road seems to bring them back to that same question. Why did they react the way they did? Why did they hold back? Why did they listen to certain people over their own intuition? Why did fear have such a strong influence over their choices? Those questions aren't arriving with judgment. They're arriving with curiosity. And curiosity is powerful because curiosity creates movement. Curiosity opens doors. Curiosity allows somebody to explore parts of themselves they previously avoided. That's why I keep seeing a more mature version of this person emerging. Not perfect, not suddenly fearless, not magically transformed overnight. Just more aware, more honest, more willing to acknowledge things they once pushed aside. And Libra, I get the feeling that some of the walls they've been examining weren't built recently. Some of them have been standing for a very long time. Long before you entered the picture. Long before this connection ever became meaningful. Which means the work they're doing now reaches deeper than one situation. Deeper than one relationship. Deeper than one conversation. Because they're not only trying to understand what happened, they're trying to understand themselves. And the more they do, the more certain old beliefs begin losing their grip. Beliefs that once felt unquestionable. Beliefs that once controlled every decision. Beliefs that quietly shaped the way they approached connection, vulnerability, and trust. And I keep feeling that something inside them is preparing to choose a different path than the one they would have chosen before. And I keep feeling that something inside them is preparing to choose a different path than the one they would have chosen before. Because standing still doesn't feel comfortable anymore. The Justice card appears again, and the atmosphere shifts in a very particular way. Not emotional in the way we've been seeing, not reflective in the way it was before. This feels deliberate. It feels like somebody sitting at a table with themselves and finally refusing to avoid the truth. You know, there comes a point where uncertainty becomes more exhausting than clarity, where not knowing becomes heavier than knowing, where silence starts demanding more energy than honesty. And that's what I keep picking up here. This person has spent so much time examining every angle, considering every possibility, questioning every emotion, that now they're reaching a place where they simply want things to make sense. Not perfect, not flawless, just real. Because I keep hearing someone say, I need to know where I stand. What's interesting is that they may have spent a long time believing they were protecting themselves by keeping everything in limbo, leaving options open, avoiding decisions, waiting for more information, waiting for certainty, waiting for the perfect moment. But the longer they waited, the more they realized that indecision is still a decision. And that realization seems to be changing everything. I can almost see them standing at a crossroads. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind from movies where thunder is crashing overhead. This feels much quieter, a normal afternoon, a normal day. Yet internally, something important is happening. Because for the first time, they're no longer asking themselves whether they feel something. They're asking themselves what they're going to do about it. And that's where the Two of Wands enters. I love the feeling of this card here because it doesn't feel impulsive. It doesn't feel reckless. This person isn't rushing, they're planning. They're envisioning. They're imagining possibilities they once refused to entertain. I keep getting images of someone looking toward the future differently than before. Not looking at obstacles, not looking at fears, looking at potential. And that's a huge shift, because when fear is driving the car, the future always looks dangerous. But when fear loosens its grip, suddenly the road begins to look a little different. Suddenly, possibilities become visible. And Libra, I have to be honest, you seem to be included in those possibilities, whether they admit that openly or not, whether they fully understand it or not. Because every time I follow this energy forward, your presence appears somewhere in the picture, not necessarily in a dramatic declaration, not necessarily in some grand fantasy, just naturally, as if they've started imagining what life looks like when they're no longer running from what they feel. The chariot appears now, and immediately I feel movement, real movement. Not emotional circles, not endless analysis, movement. The kind that starts quietly, a decision, a message drafted and deleted, a conversation rehearsed in someone's mind, a plan forming, a realization becoming action. You know what's fascinating? The energy doesn't feel perfect. There's still nervousness here, still uncertainty, still vulnerability, but there's also determination. And determination feels stronger. Because this person seems tired of carrying questions they could answer, tired of wondering, tired of replaying scenarios without ever stepping into reality. I keep hearing something has to change, not because they're forcing an outcome, but because remaining exactly where they are no longer feels sustainable. And then, the Two of Cups appears. The atmosphere softens immediately. Everything becomes quieter, more personal, more intimate. I keep feeling someone recognizing that relationships aren't built through assumptions. They're built through presence, through honesty, through mutual understanding. And what strikes me most about this card is that it feels equal, balanced. Which is interesting because balance has been showing up repeatedly throughout this reading. Not one person carrying everything. Not one person doing all the work. Not one person guessing while the other remains silent. There is a longing here for mutuality. A longing for both people to stand in the same space emotionally. To see each other clearly. To hear each other clearly. To stop interpreting shadows and finally look at what's actually there. And I think that's part of what this person is beginning to understand. They don't want assumptions anymore. They don't want secondhand information. They don't want endless speculation. Because assumptions created confusion. Silence created distance. Fear created walls. And now those walls feel much less appealing than they once did. Okay, I keep getting this image. It's very simple. Two people standing on opposite sides of a river, not angry, not disconnected, just separated, watching, waiting, wondering. And for a long time, neither side knew how to build a bridge. But something about the energy now feels different. It feels like somebody has finally stopped staring at the water and started looking for a way across. Not because all the answers have appeared. Not because every concern has vanished. But because the desire for connection is becoming stronger than the comfort of distance. And that realization seems to be growing every day. Because the more clarity this person gains, the harder it becomes to return to the version of themselves that was content with uncertainty. Because the more clarity this person gains, the harder it becomes to return to the version of themselves that was content with uncertainty. And that's exactly where the energy becomes incredibly tender. Not dramatic, not rushed, not overwhelming, just honest. The Ace of Cups appears, and the moment it does, I get this feeling that something inside this person has softened. You know, there are times when people spend so much energy protecting their hearts that they forget what it feels like to actually listen to them. They become experts at analyzing, experts at avoiding, experts at explaining away emotions before those emotions have a chance to breathe. But I don't think that's working anymore. I think this person is reaching a place where logic has taken them as far as it can. And now they're standing face to face with feelings that refuse to be ignored. What's interesting is that these feelings don't feel new. They feel acknowledged. That's different, because something can exist for a long time without being fully recognized. Something can quietly live inside somebody's heart while their mind keeps searching for reasons not to look at it. But eventually, the distance between what somebody feels and what somebody admits becomes impossible to maintain. And I keep sensing that happening here. I keep seeing somebody imagining conversations, not arguments, not confrontations, conversations, the kind that begin with a deep breath, the kind where somebody finally says what they've been carrying, the kind where explanations replace assumptions, because there are things this person wishes they had expressed sooner, things they wish they had clarified, things they wish they had trusted themselves enough to say. And Libra, I have to be honest, the energy feels vulnerable, not weak, vulnerable. There is a difference. Because vulnerability requires courage. It requires someone to lower defenses they spent a very long time building. And that's exactly what I'm seeing. The Lovers appears here, and suddenly the reading feels intensely personal. Not because somebody is making a grand declaration, but because somebody is beginning to understand the significance of a choice, a real choice. Not a hypothetical one, not one hidden safely inside their imagination. A choice that asks them to stop standing on the sidelines of their own emotions, and I keep feeling that this realization has been growing quietly for a while, like a seed beneath the soil, invisible, patient, waiting. Then one day it breaks through the surface, and everyone thinks it appeared overnight. But the truth is, the growth was happening all along. That's how this feels. This person may have appeared uncertain on the outside, reserved on the outside, conflicted on the outside, yet underneath, something has been developing. Something has been becoming clearer, and now they seem less interested in avoiding their feelings and more interested in understanding them. The Two of Cups appears again, and immediately I'm drawn back to the image of two people seeing one another clearly. Not through fear, not through old misunderstandings, not through assumptions. Just clearly, because I keep sensing that this person wants to be understood. But what's fascinating is that they're beginning to realize understanding goes both ways. They want you to know things they never fully expressed. They want certain actions to make sense, certain silences to make sense, certain decisions to make sense. Not as excuses, more like context. The difference matters, because excuses protect behavior. Context explains behavior. And I don't think this person is trying to escape responsibility. I think they're trying to reveal parts of themselves they kept hidden. Parts they weren't ready to share before. Parts they barely understood themselves. I keep getting this image of somebody staring at a message box, not typing yet, just staring, thinking, deleting words before they're even written, trying to find language big enough to hold everything they want to say. because sometimes emotions are complicated. Not because they're unclear, but because they're difficult to translate into words. And this person feels very aware of that. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to create more confusion. They don't want to leave important things unsaid. And yet they also know silence has reached its limit. The Ten of Cups appears, and the energy becomes surprisingly peaceful. Not because everything has been solved, not because every question has been answered, because for the first time, this person seems to be looking beyond fear, beyond old obstacles, beyond old stories. I keep seeing someone allowing themselves to imagine happiness without immediately looking for reasons it can't work. That's significant, because fear always asks what could go wrong. The heart asks different questions. The heart asks, what if connection is possible? The heart asks, what if understanding is possible? The heart asks, what if honesty creates something better than silence ever could? And that's where this energy seems to be leading, toward honesty, toward openness, toward truths that have remained hidden for far too long. What's beautiful is that none of this feels forced. No pressure, no manipulation, no dramatic performance. Just somebody becoming more willing to show up authentically than they were before. And I keep feeling this gentle shift taking place. A shift from protection to participation, from observation to engagement, from wondering to expressing. Because the more this person listens to their own heart, the more difficult it becomes to pretend they don't hear what it's been saying all along. And there is still something they haven't fully spoken yet. Something that seems to linger right at the edge of expression. Like words gathering themselves. Like courage slowly finding its footing. Like a conversation waiting for the exact moment when silence finally decides to step aside. And Libra, I think that's where I'm going to leave this reading. There's something beautiful about allowing people to arrive at their own understanding in their own time. Sometimes the answers we're looking for don't appear all at once. They reveal themselves little by little through reflection, through honesty, and through the conversations we never expected to matter so much. So if this message resonated with you, take what feels right, leave what doesn't, and trust your own intuition above all else. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I truly appreciate your energy, your presence, and the space we've shared here together. Until we meet again, take gentle care of yourself, Libra. And remember, not every important conversation begins out loud. Sometimes it starts quietly in someone's heart, long before the words are ever spoken. Okay, I'll see you in the next reading.